All right, we are recording. Keep in mind that your exam is Tuesday of next week. Regular class time, 11 o'clock. So we're taking it together in room 143, which is where I am now, in Chambers. I sent out an email yesterday, I think, with the time for the final. Remember, you will be taking after Thanksgiving, then we go full remote. We won't be coming back to campus, and you'll be taking the exam. Will be proctored. You will take it at the time the university has designated for Tuesday, Thursday, 11 o'clock classes. And can you remind me of when that was? Whatever's in the email. I believe it's the 17th at 9 o'clock. 9:30? Okay. Whatever's in the email. That is correct. I made very sure that I put the right number in the email. You should have gotten an email from Teresa Seymour about the proctoring. We will be using something. There are different names associated with the Monitor EDU, Mobile Proctor. That's the same thing. That's what we will be using. I haven't heard of any problems with using that. You don't have to install anything on your computer. You do have to have a telephone, a cell phone with a camera, so that the proctor can see you, and you have to be able to. They will give you the directions in that email, but you don't have to install anything on your computer. You may have heard of students taking exams with ProctorU where there were problems. I've talked to a lot of students in my classes where there are lots of problems. Usually they haven't installed a certain extension properly, but the important thing is that you don't have to do that for this exam. You'll be, I believe there'll be a link that I will send you. I haven't set that up yet, but I haven't heard of any problems with using the proctoring service that we will be using. Let's see, any questions? Yes. I believe that is correct, that you do not have to make a reservation. Yeah, this is not ProctorU, and I don't believe you have to make a reservation. You do have to set up an account. You have to pay for it. It's not free, but I will get you a little more details on that, but they should be included. Did you get an email from Teresa Seymour? Okay. I didn't see that email, but I'll try to get it and look at it, and then if I see any holes in it, I'll let you know. I didn't know that you were supposed to do it on your phone. I thought you could just log in on your laptop. Well, no, you log into Moodle and you take the exam through Moodle, but you need a phone that has a camera. You set it to the side, and then they can see you. You verify you don't have other books or things around, and then you set it there so that they can see what you're doing. But there's no direct connection between the monitor and your computer. That's where the difficulty comes in when you have to have that direct connection with ProctorU. And the reason I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is that OpenNote or?
That's a good question. It will be the same as on the other exams. You can use a 3x5 inch note card, and you will be allowed to have one blank piece of paper, because you do need to be able to draw graphs. So you will be allowed those. I will give those instructions to the proctor. But apart from that, you can't have other things. Okay? All right, and remember, that's the final for your exam on Tuesday. It is works exactly the same as before. You take it in class, you can use the 3x5 card. Today, we are going to take a good bit of time and possibly the whole time in doing some review of chapter 32, because it is a difficult chapter, lots of stuff there. We will be making use of it in some things we do after Thanksgiving. So it's important to understand it. And so if you've looked at the study guide I put up for chapter 32, the last 2 pages are actually questions. And I tried to go through and list what are the things you need to understand for chapter 32. And so as I was thinking about, well, what would be the best way to review today, I decided, well, we'll just go through those questions, and I will show how you would approach them. Keep in mind, on all economics exams, the biggest mistakes people make are they don't read the question carefully. They go through it too fast, they misread it, they bring in things that aren't there. So take your time, read carefully, think about what the question means. On the exam 3, the questions over chapter 32, there'll be multiple choice just like on the other exams, but they will be dealing with these things that are in these questions. And so I will read these. If you don't have a copy, if you're Zooming, you can pull this up from the macro resources page. If you're here, if you don't have it printed out, well, you can listen to me, because I'm going to read these, and then we will go through the how you would answer these. Let's see. Okay. Question 1. What do we use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to explain? So you want to have the big picture. What are we trying to do? Okay, people get lost in all the details. What are we trying to do? Well, we are trying to understand what causes inflation, what determines how much inflation we're going to have, which means what determines what happens to prices in general. Are we going to have high inflation, low inflation? Are prices going to be stable? That's what the inflation rate is all about. We're interested in that, and we're interested in the growth rate of real GDP. How fast is the economy's output increasing? Or is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Those are the 2 main things we're interested in. We're trying to explain, because this has to do with the business cycle. We see these fluctuations in the economy, and these fluctuations are very painful. When we go into recession, millions of people lose their jobs. So we'd like to understand what causes these things. And if we can understand that, then maybe the government can do something, either to, if the government is causing it, they can stop doing what is causing the problem, or they can identify policies that will make recessions less frequent or less severe. So that's what we're trying to do, and we do that by thinking about spending, aggregate demand, and supply. We've got the short run and the long run. And always in economics, you're interested in equilibrium. You got all these different forces that are having an impact on the variables we care about. You can't just look at one of them. You got to look at all of them, but how do you put them all together? Well, that's the great thing about a graph. It allows you to say, well, spending is important and production is important. And in the short run, production, the effect of of prices is different than it is in the long run. So the graph takes all that complexity and embodies it in those curves. And once you have those curves and you see an equilibrium or you see an intersection, you know that's the equilibrium. That is where we're going to end up being. That's the general idea. Question number 2. What does the aggregate demand curve show? Okay, here's our aggregate demand curve, negatively sloped. Remember, it is describing spending, but more specifically, it is describing the combinations of inflation rates and the growth of real GDP, which add up to a particular rate of spending growth. We are making an assumption. We're making an assumption that we know when we draw a particular aggregate demand curve, we are making an assumption about how fast spending is going to increase. So this aggregate demand curve is starting with the assumption that we know, we have reason to believe that spending is going to grow by 5% over the coming year. If that's going to happen, there are a number of ways that could occur. Spending could increase by 5% because output increased by 5% and prices didn't change at all. 5% plus 0 would be 5% growth in spending. We could be somewhere like this, where we have prices going up by 5%, but real output is staying the same. So that combination, 5 plus 0 is 5. So again, that would give us 5% spending growth. Every point on that curve adds up to 5% spending growth. So if we know that spending is going to grow by 5%, then we know that we're going to be somewhere on that curve. Okay? Doesn't tell us where. We need aggregate supply for that, but it does tell us the inflation rate, output growth rates that add up to 5% spending growth. That's what the AD curve does, or that's what it shows us. Just keep in mind, you can look at the same graph day after day after day, but if you never understand it, you start thinking you do because it's so familiar. You know, yeah, I saw that yesterday and the day before and the day before. And your familiarity with it makes you think you understand it. So you really have to look at each curve, look at each point and say, so I really know what this means. And if you understand the basics of what each curve means, then you find that the conclusions really aren't that complicated. It's understanding the parts of the model. That's the key to success. You understand the parts, and then the rest of it's easy. But if you focus on trying to memorize all the conclusions, it's hopeless. Okay, number 3. Considered aggregate demand curve based on the assumption that spending will grow at 5% each year. Well, that's what we have there. Given that, if output grows at 3%, what will the inflation rate be? What's the answer? It's going to be 2, okay? Because the AD curve that we're seeing there is exactly what this question is referring to. And if output is going to grow by 3, then we're going to be here. Inflation rate will be 2. Okay? So if you know the spending growth rate and you know either one of these variables, then you can figure out what the other one is going to be. Okay? If inflation is 1%, you know real GDP is going to grow by 4%. And if the inflation rate is 4% from the questions, this is 3B, what will the growth rate of output be? Well, if inflation is 4, it's going to be somewhere in here, then the growth rate of output would have to be 1. Okay, that's right. Number 4. If output grows at 4% and inflation is 0, what rate will spending grow? Well, that's going to be 5%, because the rate of what we've done here is start with an assumption that spending will grow by 5. And then that allowed us to say, well, this plus this will equal 5. But if you don't know the rate at which spending is growing, but you know the inflation rate and the real growth rate, you add those together, that would give you the spending growth rate. Say number 5, if the growth rate of spending increases, what will happen to the aggregate demand curve? If it decreases, what will happen to the aggregate demand curve? Okay. Well, if
goes to the left, this one goes to the left and down.
okay, if spending is going to, if spending growth is going to increase, say to 8%, which way is it going to go?
Outward, right? Yes.
That's right. If spending growth is going to increase, okay, then the curve is shifting to the right or up. Okay, so it's an outward shift. Okay, that's an increase in aggregate demand. If spending growth is going to decrease, say to 3% or to 2%, then that would do the opposite, shift down and to the left. And remember, every point on the aggregate demand curve, if you add the inflation rate plus the real growth rate, then those two together give you the growth rate of total spending. All right, this is just explaining what we just said. If spending growth increases, whether it's, no matter what the cause, if spending growth increases, aggregate demand shifts, and it shifts to the right and up. If it decreases, no matter what the cause, it is going to shift to the, do that. It is going to shift to the left. Like that. Okay. Number 6. What are the two main causes of a rightward shift of aggregate demand? As you read a question, think about what it means, and sometimes it's good to rephrase it. Okay? Two main causes of a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Well, if aggregate demand is shifting, that's a demand shock. Okay? And if it's shifting to the right, that's a positive demand shock. Okay? If it's shifting to the left, that's a negative demand shock. Even going through simple questions can be very helpful. If you remember, the goal isn't just to find out what the answer to this question is. The goal is to use it to think through your understanding of the question. When you know, as I go through it now, I take the question, I look at a graph, and I try to explain it as fully as I can. The right way to study is for you to go through these questions and act as though you're helping somebody else who doesn't understand it. You're going through every little detail. And if you do that, it will really, really help you. Okay? When I was in graduate school, I remember there was this guy in our class that I just felt sorry for him because he just didn't seem like he understood anything. And I thought, this guy's never going to make it. And but I got in a study group with him, and I benefited tremendously because he would ask all these questions, and I would think, I can't believe he doesn't understand that. And I would start explaining it, and I'd get into it, and I'd realize, I don't understand it as well as I thought I did. And so I benefited tremendously from working with him, even though I knew more than he did. It made me go back and think through things I didn't really understand. So I benefited from it, and apparently he benefited from it as well, because the last time I heard about him, he was the dean of SMU Business School. So people can have trouble with economics at first and still do very well. So don't get discouraged if you have trouble with it. What are the two main causes of a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve? Well, we have those really listed here. An increase in spending can be the result of an increase in the growth rate of the money supply, or it can be the result of an increase in the growth rate of velocity. Both of those will increase the spending growth rate and shift aggregate demand to the right. Okay, and if we wanted when you read the question, think about the things you have to look for. Here, we're not talking, what kind of shock are we looking for? We're not looking for a supply shock. We're looking for a demand shock. What can shift aggregate demand? And we're not just looking for anything that will shift aggregate demand either way. We're looking for something that will cause a rightward shift of aggregate demand. It is normal and appropriate to read a question more than once. Do not assume that you read it once and you got it. You need to read it more than once to make sure that that you haven't missed something. When you're taking the exam on paper, I would very strongly encourage you to take your pencil and underline the words that are important, because you want those words to really stand out. You can't do that when you take it on the computer, but you can. You might want to just write down the key words on paper, because you want to be sure that you're thinking about aggregate demand, not supply. You want to be sure that you're thinking about an increase, not a decrease. And it's just so easy to make mistakes. And one of the benefits of studying economics is that it makes you aware of how easy it is to make mistakes. So you become better at not making mistakes. That is something that you acquire skill in, and it takes practice. I used to teach a finance course senior level course where an exam would have maybe 10 or 15 problems on it, and they were all mathematical. And you might have, half a page of calculations to get to the answer. And it was all or nothing. You got it right or you got it wrong. And if you went through most of it and you made a mistake and got the wrong answer, you didn't get any credit for it. And a lot of people thought, I'll never be able to pass this class. But it was very gratifying to see those people who really thought, I'll never be able to do this, get to the end of the semester and they saw that, yeah, I can do this. It took me a lot of work and it took a lot of practice, but I can do this. I can get the right answer. And it just takes practice. And the more time you spend on it, the more your ability to read correctly and think correctly will grow. It's not something that most people are just naturally good at. The more you practice it, the better you will be at it. Let's see, number 7. Explain what will happen to the aggregate demand curve if, first, consumers become more confident about the future. Okay? Well, we're using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. So you don't look at that and just think, to yourself, well, I wonder what would happen. No, you think, how does this fit into our model? Okay? And you remember, well, we've got 3 curves. This, no doubt, is something that's going to shift one of the curves. So you think about, what did we say? Because the questions are going to be dealing with things we have talked about. And we said that, let's see. I didn't have another graph here. We said that one event that can shift aggregate demand is if we have a change in the growth rate of velocity. And we said there are a number of things that will cause that to change. particular, we said, remember that GDP is one way to calculate it. It is spending on consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. And we said that anytime there is a change in one of these spending components, that is going to change velocity. If the growth rate of consumption spending changes, increases, the growth of velocity is going to, growth rate of velocity is going to increase. For each one of these, if any of them, the growth rate increases, then the growth rate of velocity is going to increase, which means the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So here we have listed 5 different things, but really all you have to think about is how will each of these affect the growth of velocity? And if you're told something that is going to increase the growth rate of any kind of spending, that's going to increase the growth rate of velocity, that's going to increase aggregate demand. So if consumers become more confident about the future, well, if they're more confident, what do? They're going to buy more. Okay? If they become more pessimistic about the future, they're going to buy less. Okay? Businesses become more pessimistic about the profit outlook for the future. If they become pessimistic, they think it's not going to be profitable to build manufacturing. So they're going to cut back on investment spending. That means that growth rate of velocity is going to go down, aggregate demand is going to decrease. These may seem complicated, but you just have to figure out, is this going to increase velocity or decrease velocity? Government cuts taxes on individuals and on business income from investments. Okay, well, here you have to think about if taxes are lower, how does that affect individuals? How does that affect you? Right? If you now have to pay less tax, you have more disposable income. And with more disposable income, what are you probably going to do? You're going to buy more stuff. So if taxes go down, that means spending is going to go up. Okay? Government increases its spending. Well, that's spending, so that's going to increase velocity and shift aggregate demand to the right. Economic conditions in other countries improve with the result that people in other countries want to buy more American output. Well, that would be a change in the growth rate of foreign sector spending. So it's going up, so the growth rate of velocity goes up, aggregate demand is going to increase. Okay? Didn't directly talk about it here, but one thing you do want to remember is that there's reason to believe that changes in the growth of velocity are temporary. So these changes will shift aggregate demand, but we believe that in the long run, the velocity will go back, or the growth of velocity will go back to where it was before. So you would have here a rightward shift of the curve, and then at some point in the future, it would revert back to where it was. Okay? So anytime you have a change in the growth rate of velocity, we believe that will tend to be temporary. Okay, number 8. What does the long run, LRAS, the long run aggregate supply curve, when you see an abbreviation, you want to, don't go through it as fast as you can. Think about, remind yourself, okay, what does that stand for? Long run aggregate supply. And you visualize, what does it look like? And you should remember that it's going to be a vertical line. Okay? Anytime, so in answering this question, in studying, you want to draw your graph, draw it vertical. Then you explain to yourself why it's vertical. And what does that mean? Anytime you have a vertical line, it is telling you that there is no relationship between these two variables. If you have a change in the inflation rate, has no effect on output. If inflation is 2%, the growth rate of real output is going to be at the SOLO or the potential growth rate. If you have 10% inflation, has no long-run effect on the growth rate of output. We're still going to be at that SOLO potential growth rate, which we generally assume is going to be around 3%. Anytime you have a vertical curve, means there's the value of the variable on the vertical axis has no effect on the value of the variable on the horizontal axis. And then the last part of question 8, at what growth rate of real output is the long-run aggregate supply curve vertical? Well, it is what we call the SOLO growth rate. You could also call it the long-run growth rate. It's the growth rate of potential GDP. That growth rate, this is what was talked about in chapter 28, which we didn't spend a lot of time on, but we said that that long-run potential growth rate is a function of real factors. How fast is the capital stock increasing? How fast is our labor force increasing? How fast is our human capital? How fast is our technology improving? Those are not financial variables. Okay? Those are independent of how much people want to spend. Okay? Those are the variables that determine the potential growth rate are the things that determine how much can we actually produce with the resources and the technology that we have. Okay? And just as a footnote, I would say that we have talked about the Keynesian school of thought, which dominated economics from the 40s through at least through the 70s, and it's still extremely influential today. The Keynesian view tends to focus on the short run, and it tends to focus on demand side factors. Okay? When I started teaching economics, the school that I was at was using a very Keynesian book, and so the focus was completely on spending. Okay? There was no focus at all on how much can we actually produce. Thankfully, the model that you are seeing in chapter 32 is much more realistic than the model that I had to teach when I started teaching. Okay. Number 9, the vertical slope of the long-run aggregate supply reflects the idea that in the long run, money is what?
Permanent.
I'm sorry, is what?
Is it permanent? Permanently.
No, the neutral. Neutral. In the long run, money is neutral. And what that means is in the long run, how much money exists in the economy isn't really important. Further, in the long run, the growth rate of the money supply isn't really important in determining how much output we're going to have. And that's hard for people generally to grasp, because you think about your own experience and you think, okay, if I have more money, that's not neutral. That, me having more money is a really good thing. Okay? But for society as a whole, getting more money, having more money doesn't make us better off. We'll see in chapter 34 that the Federal Reserve can create as much money as they want to. Okay? And that doesn't generally doesn't make us better off. Okay, in the long run, money is neutral. meaning it doesn't have an effect on real variables. Saying that in the long run, money is neutral really is just a different way of saying the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. Same idea. 10, by definition, the long run is a period that is long enough for full price adjustment to whatever shock has occurred. We know, just going back to chapter 3 and chapter 4, when you have a market for anything, when something happens, there's a shock of some kind, one of the curves is going to shift. And to get back into balance, to get back into equilibrium, because of the shock, the price has to adjust. Okay? And we did back in chapter 3 and chapter 4, we didn't go into the question, well, how long does it take for it to adjust? Does this happen in a few seconds? Does it take a month? We didn't go into that because that's a hard question to answer, and it's not the same for every market. For many markets, the adjustment is very fast. The stock market, new information comes out about the value of a stock. Don't expect that it's going to be next week before the price adjusts. When news comes out that a company has developed a new vaccine that is effective, the price of that stock is going to go up immediately. In fact, there's a good chance that someone may have heard about it before the news came out and the price may have already gone up. Okay? So the stock market's market where prices adjust very quickly, but not all markets adjust that quickly. So when we talk about the long run, it doesn't necessarily mean a long time. It means however long it takes for prices to go from their original equilibrium to their new equilibrium. Number 11, list events which could cause the long run aggregate supply curve to shift right. That would be a positive shock, or left, a negative shock. And somewhere in here I have a list. I don't see it. But these would be things that are generally pretty obvious. You have terrible weather that prevents people from working. Well, you're going to get less output. You have a period where you have lots of strikes. Unions go on strike. Well, if people aren't working, you're not going to get as much output produced. You have a war that causes people to be killed, causes factories to be destroyed, not operating. Well, you're not going to get as much output produced if you have fewer people and you have less capital to use. New technologies. If you get a new technology that enables us to produce the same products, but with fewer resources, okay? You're going to get more output. If we just imagine, what if somebody figured out a way that we could take sand, just regular sand, and we could cheaply convert it into energy? Well, that would be great because we got lots of sand and we'd be able to produce a lot more stuff because of that technological improvement. Okay? That's close to what happened, 150 years ago. We knew that oil existed, petroleum, but we didn't know how to get energy from it. And when somebody figured out, hey, there's a fairly simple way to get energy from this black stuff, that was an incredible technological advance. And when they come up with better technologies for getting to the oil, such that oil that's really deep, and for practical purposes we can't get to it, And then we get new technology, which enables us to get to that oil. Okay? That's a huge technological improvement. We're able to get more oil. That means we can produce more output. Technological improvements would be a positive supply shock, would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. If we have a breakdown in social order, where people who previously were more or less following the rules, obeying the law, and they stop obeying the law, then that would be a negative real shock. If you have a loss of human capital, where people, this would be one thing we should really be concerned about. That just saw yesterday that New York City has decided to close all of the public schools in the city. I won't say that that's a good decision or a bad decision, but what we should be aware of is that with kids not going to school, they're not going to get as much education. Okay? I think remote learning absolutely can work for college students. You know, we know it can work. The idea of trying to do remote learning with a second grader, you know, I would just say, you know, forget it. I'm retiring. That's not going to work. And the more time they spend out of school, the less education they're going to get. And that means that we have less human capital. That would be a negative supply shock or real shock or productivity shock. It means the same thing. Let's see. Number 12. Supply shocks are also called productivity shocks or real shocks. Okay? We don't give these things multiple names just to make life hard for you. Okay? It's just that out there in the real world, they do go by these different names. And so that you can read the news and understand what's happening, you do need to know that those terms mean the same thing.
What did you say for the first one?
Supply shocks are also called productivity shocks or real shocks. Okay? Basically, you know, we're identifying two categories of shocks: demand shocks, which are going to shift aggregate demand, or real shocks, which are going to shift aggregate supply. I would prefer to always use real shocks, okay? But you will at times hear it referred to as a productivity shock or a supply shock. If a negative real shock occurs, number 13, this will tend to push the growth rate of output and the inflation rate. Questions like this, number 13, this is just incredibly easy. But in the past, I see lots and lots of people missing questions like this. Okay? If you don't draw the graph, then you just have to think back in your mind over everything we've talked about and try to figure it out. And good luck with that. Okay? If you draw the graph, see, you should look at a question like that and think, okay, what graph do I need to draw? And this is the graph that you need to draw. Negative real shock. Okay, since we're talking about a real shock, means that it's the long run aggregate supply curve that's going to shift. And if it's negative, that means it's going to shift to the left. Okay? And we want to know what will that do to the growth rate of output and the inflation rate. Okay? Well, this is exactly what the model is designed to analyze. So you're going to have the long run AS. The negative real shock means it's shifting to the right, to the left, to the left. And all you have to do, once you remember negative real shock means long run AS shifts to the left, all you have to do is say, where did we start? Well, we started at that equilibrium. Where do we end up? We end up at that intersection. Okay? You don't have to understand everything we've done perfectly to be able to draw that graph, recognize this point, recognize that point, and say, well, real growth started at 3% and it went to -1, so that's a decrease. And the inflation rate started at 7 and it went to 11, so that's an increase. Okay? You draw the graph, it's simple. Okay? But I would say that often over half the class will miss a question like that. And it's because they're not answering the question with the model we've developed to answer questions like that. They're answering the question with the ideas they came into the course with. Okay? And that's just not going to work. If you can draw a graph, draw a graph. It will help you, especially with something like this. All right. Number 14. If a positive real shock occurs, what's that going to do? Well, if you can answer this one, you can answer. If you can answer 13, you can answer 14. It's just shifting the curve the other way. So the inflation rate is going to go down. The growth rate of real output is going to go up. Okay? People don't believe it, but if you use the graph, so many questions are just simple. Okay? If you don't use the graph, they're really, really hard. So do it the easy way. Draw the graph. What does the term business cycle refer to? Well, we said that it refers to short-run fluctuations. We know that over time, the average growth rate, I think this is from 70 years, something like that, the average growth rate has been around 3.2%. So that's the red line. But if you look at what happened each year or each quarter, we see all these fluctuations. It's those fluctuations that we're referring to when we talk about the business cycle. The fact that we don't just have a smooth increase at a constant rate. We have, look at this, you've got increases, over 15%, you got decreases of over 10%, bouncing around a lot. Those fluctuations are very disruptive to the economy, very disruptive to people's lives. So, if there's a way we can prevent that, then we would certainly want to do it. It's no doubt we would like to prevent them. The real question is, well, what can be done to prevent them? It's always possible that you try to make something better and you end up making it worse. If you go to a doctor and you're feeling sick and he gives you something, says, oh, this will make you feel better, it's always possible that it will have some unexpected consequences. So once we get over to chapter 35 and 36, we will start talking about what potentially can the government do and what can the Federal Reserve do to try to minimize the problems caused by recession. Everybody agrees we'd like to minimize those problems. The disagreement is over what will work. In the real world, what will make things better, what's likely to make things worse. 16, what are the two causes of the business cycle? Well, you could simply say the shocks. You've got demand shocks, you've got real shocks. The growth rate is going, you could restate this as what can cause the growth rate of real output to decrease or to increase. And it's going to be, well, you can have a demand shock, which shifts aggregate demand to the right or to the left, or you can have a supply shock, which is going to shift the longer and aggregate supply curve. Okay. 17, if the growth rate of velocity increases, how will this affect aggregate demand, the growth rate of real output, and the inflation rate? Okay. Well, we've talked about this before, but this is asking it a little bit differently. If the growth rate of velocity increases, you said the growth rate of velocity is one of the two determinants of where the aggregate demand curve is going to be. So if the growth rate of velocity increases, that means that the growth rate of spending is going to increase, and that is going to cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. This is going to be a positive demand shock. And what happens to the growth rate of real output and the inflation rate? Well, if you've drawn the graph, then the answer to that part is right there in front of you. We started here, velocity changed, or growth rate of velocity changed, so aggregate demand increased. In the short run, we're going to move over to here. So if we're moving from here to here, growth rate of real output's going up, and the growth rate of prices, the inflation rate, is going up as well. Okay? Don't try to memorize all that, just understand how to use the graph, and the graph will give you the right answers if you use it correctly. You've got to understand what each curve means. You've got to remember what will shift each curve. And then on the test, draw the graph, shift the curves, and see what happens. 18, if the growth rate of consumption spending increases temporarily, how will this affect the growth rate of velocity, output, and prices? Well, what we have here is an answer to that question. If growth rate of spending increases temporarily, then velocity, the growth rate of velocity will increase. Total spending will increase faster. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. Output goes up faster. We have more inflation. Okay? If it's temporary, then that means that what went up is going to go back down. So that would just mean that at some point in the future, aggregate demand is going to shift back down, which means we move from here back to where we were before. Okay? So growth rate of output drops back to the potential growth rate, and the inflation rate drops back to 2%. Okay? Number 19, if a negative real shock occurs, how will this affect the growth rate of output and the growth rate of prices? This is just another application of things we've already talked about. Number 19, if it's a real shock, which curve is going to shift? The long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? Real always means it's going to be the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? So if it's a real shock, and it's shifting like that. We started here. We're going to end up here. The growth rate of real output is going to be lower, so it goes down, and the inflation rate is going to go up. This is the kind of question in the past I've seen people have incredible difficulty. Well, they didn't find it difficult, they just got it wrong. Okay? They just took a wild guess and they got it wrong. But if you draw the graph and you know negative real shock means long run AS shifts to the left, and you can identify this point and that point, it's not a hard question to answer. Okay? All right, number 20. If a positive demand shock occurs, how will this affect the growth rate of output and the inflation rate? Well, start out in equilibrium, 2% inflation, 3% growth rate. Since this is let's see, a positive demand shock. Okay. Okay, we start out here. If it's a positive demand shock, which curve shifts? Higher demand. And if it's a positive shock, which way is it going to shift?
To the right.
It's going to shift to the right. Okay. So where do we end up in the short run? We end up at the new equilibrium, which is always at the new intersection. So you can see the growth rate of output is higher, and the inflation rate is going to be higher. Let's say it goes up to 4%. Okay. In the short run, that's all that happens. The economy has been stimulated by this positive demand shock. Okay. Are we going to stay there forever? Okay. Well, no, if we're above the potential growth rate, we can't stay there forever. We'd like to, but we can't. And what's going to happen? Well, when you're in a situation like this, you want to know what's going to happen. You think about inflation. Okay? The economy is experiencing 4% inflation. Okay? People are seeing every period prices going up at 4% per year. How much inflation are people expecting? They're only expecting 2%. Okay? So this is unanticipated inflation. People thought prices would go up by 2, they go up by 4. Eventually, people realize my expectations are wrong. There's not going to be 2%, there's going to be 4% inflation. And a key thing to remember is that when people start to expect more inflation, the short run average supply curve is going to shift. We only talked about one thing that would shift the short run average supply curve, and that was a change in expected inflation. If people start to expect more inflation, then it's going to shift up. If they start to expect less inflation, then it's going to shift down. Okay? So we end up moving in the long run from here to there. Notice in the long run, the inflation rate will be even higher. Okay? Okay, this 5%, that's only for the first aggregate demand curve. The new aggregate demand curve would have a higher growth rate of spending. Okay? Once we get to here, the inflation rate is going to be higher. We don't know for sure what it would be because I didn't specify the new growth rate of spending. But let's say it's 6%. Okay? Once we get to this new equilibrium, we're going to have a new short run aggregate supply curve based on expected inflation of 6%. Okay? In the short run, there was more inflation than people were expecting, so they revised their expectations up. That shifted the short run average supply curve up, and we end up back at the growth rate of potential output with higher actual inflation, and where that higher inflation rate is anticipated. Okay? So once we're here, we fully adjusted to
the long run effects of the aggregate demand shock. Okay. All right, that was number 21. Number 22, if a negative demand shock occurs, how will this affect the same things? Well, we'll go through that. I think my graph was supposed to be for that. A negative demand shock would shift. I'll just talk you through it because it's exactly the opposite of what we just did. If it's a negative demand shock, the AD curve is shifting to the left. In the short run, for example, let's say that we were starting here. Use green. Let's say we're starting here, and we have a negative demand shock, which means the AD shifts to the left. In the short run, we're going to move to here. So what happens to the inflation rate? It goes down, and the growth rate of real output is going to go down. In the long run, what would happen? Well, people were expecting 6% inflation, but now inflation is less than they were expecting. So eventually people adjust their expectations and they realize, oh, we're not going to have as much inflation. And when people start to expect less inflation, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift down, and that's going to push us back to here, where we end up with even lower inflation than we had in the short run. Okay? And real growth rate moves back to potential. Okay? 22. According to Keynes, what is sticky in the short run? There's a simple answer, and then there's a really complicated long answer. The simple answer is wages and prices. Okay? He said a lot of different things, but sticky wages would be the key thing, but he also talked about prices being sticky. Producers being reluctant to lower their prices. And if prices and wages are, remember, wages are just one kind of a price. The wage rate is the price of labor. If wages and prices are sticky, that means they're slow to adjust. And if we're slow to adjust, that means that when changes occur, we're going to end up moving away from the long run potential growth rates. Okay? If wages and prices adjust very quickly, basically, if wages and prices adjust quickly enough, we could just eliminate the short run aggregate supply curve, and life would be much simpler. We could just say, well, if people spend more, we'll get more inflation. If people spend less, then we'll get less inflation, and we would always be at that potential growth rate. The problem is that wages and prices don't adjust instantly, and it's that slowness in adjusting that creates difficulties. 23, this is something we've already touched on. In the short run, if the actual inflation rate is higher than people expected, what happens to the growth rate of real output? Okay? If people, that would be corresponding to a point like this, where people were expecting 2% inflation. We're on the 2% curve, but we're actually experiencing 4% inflation. Okay? People are, actual inflation is 4, expected is 2. What happens to the growth rate of real output? Well, that's the end result. When actual inflation is greater than expected, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift. Okay? That's the key thing that happens. And when the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, then we're going to move up the curve. So the growth rate of real output is going to go down. Okay? If 24, if the expected rate of inflation increases, what happens to the short run aggregate supply curve? It's going to shift up. People expect more inflation, short run aggregate supply shifts up. If they expect less inflation, it's going to shift down. And we could use, if we had time, we would go through and apply this to what happened in the 70s and the 80s with inflation. As inflation got worse and worse, people expected more and more, and then it came down, and then gradually people expected less. You can really explain what happened in terms of this model. 25, the economy will be in long run equilibrium when the actual inflation rate equals the expected inflation rate. Notice if we are at a point, if we're at a point like this, okay, that's on the long run aggregate supply curve. It's on an aggregate demand curve. Just forget about the red one there. If we're here, what's the actual inflation rate? 2%. What is the expected inflation rate? 2%. Okay? That's long run equilibrium. If we're at a point like this, then expected is 2, actual is 4. That's not a long run equilibrium, okay? Because something is going, remember, equilibrium is where everything is in balance, everything has adjusted, there are no more changes that are going to occur. If we're here, we know people are not expecting as much inflation as is occurring, so they're going to start expecting more, and when they do, this short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift up. Let's see. 26. When a positive demand shock occurs, what happens to the growth rate of output and inflation? Okay, well, this is just designed to get you to use the model, because you make a mistake if you think positive demand shock and then you try to figure out if you see this as being a direct change, you're going to have problems. What you want to see is, okay, it's saying talking about a positive demand shock, so you draw an equilibrium. You draw your demand curve, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. We're starting at a point like that. Then you say, okay, a positive demand shock occurs. Well, that means aggregate demand is shifting to the right. Where are we going to move? We're going to move from A to B. So what has happened? The answer is right there. The growth rate of output goes up and the inflation rate goes up. Okay? So expect to find the answers on the graph, not by looking into your head. Okay? Draw the graph, find answers on the graph. That's what happens in the short run. We move from A to B. In the long run, when we talk about the long run, we're saying, well, what's going to happen when enough time has passed for everything to adjust? Okay? And if we're at B, we say, okay, we're on this aggregate supply curve. People are expecting 2% inflation. What is the inflation rate? It is 4%. Inflation is higher than people expected. Eventually, they're going to catch on. They start to expect 4% inflation. And when they start to expect 4% inflation, the whole aggregate supply curve is going to shift up. Okay? And that means our equilibrium is going to move from B up to C. Okay? So the growth rate of real output goes back down to the potential growth rate, and the inflation rate gets even higher. Okay. Almost out of time. Let's see. 3216 explains the Great Depression of the 30s as largely as the result of a series of demand shocks. There were also real shocks, but primarily, most people who've studied it carefully believe that it's primarily the result of the real shocks. And this is the graph that shows that consumers cut back on their spending, businesses, investment spending dropped almost zero because businesses were very pessimistic about the future. And the Fed cut back on the growth. Well, they didn't just cut back on the growth rate of the money supply, they cut back on the money supply. It dropped by 33%. So you got big adjustments, negative shocks that in the short run would move us from here to a point like that, giving us negative inflation, deflation. Prices did go down during the 1930s, but to make things worse, the Roosevelt administration tried very actively to prevent prices from going down. Okay? And if you don't let prices go to their equilibrium level, then you have even more problems than you otherwise would have had. 28, show how an increase in the growth rate of the money supply will affect everything, basically. Okay? When the growth rate of the money, this is real simple. When the growth rate of the money supply increases, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Okay? That's the key thing that is going to happen. So move from here to something like that. You're going to get the economy is stimulated, output increases at a faster rate. We have some inflation, okay, more inflation, but if they continue to increase it at the same rate, we're not going to be able to stay here, okay? Because people are continuing to expect 2% inflation. Maybe inflation is 5%. Okay? Since the actual inflation rate is higher than people expected, that means that the short run aggregate supply is going to shift up. And we're going to end up, what we have here is the short run, but when expectations adjust, we move from here back to here. The Fed is still increasing the money supply faster than before, but the growth rate of output is back at 3%. The only long run effect the Fed has had is that we're now going to get higher inflation than we had before, okay? Which is kind of what happened in the latter part of the 1970s. The Fed was increasing the money supply faster and faster. It did stimulate the economy, but inflation kept going higher and higher and led to problems. All right, we are out of time. And I don't think the number 29 is anything different really from what we've done before. So expect to need to understand these things that we've gone over today. I don't lightly give up a lecture, but I felt like it was worth going back through these things. So expect questions on the exam where if you understand these things, you say, I know how to do this, okay? Any questions? Yeah.
Just to confirm, Tuesday's test will be in this room?
Just to confirm, the exam 3 will be Tuesday, will be in this room, room 143 of Chambers Hall at 11 o'clock. Yes. You can bring your note card and remember your MRU videos. They don't absolutely have to be put up by the exam day, but sometime around there. All right, let me know if you have any questions.